His rebounding over the last 3 years went up like almost 2 a game from what his average was. So I don't know if it's because of his place in his career or because of the emphasis now, because the number of guys that get a triple-double, I mean, there's guys that shouldn't even be getting triple-doubles that can get a triple-double. I mean, Ben Simmons is a guy that feels like he could be the next guy that could average a triple-double for a year if he really wanted to. Points might be his biggest issue at this point because he seems like he can get the rebounds and assists whenever he needs to. So I don't really know with LeBron. Maybe it just wasn't a point of emphasis for him, but it feels like now, yeah, every night he could go out and get one.
Well, speaking of stat lines, and I agree, Russell Westbrook's a great player, and I've grown to like his game a little bit more over the past couple of years, and there's no doubt he plays hard, and I think his stat lines are legit. But let's talk about another guy whose stat lines may come into question as far as whether or not they're legit or not, and that's Kyle Busch over in the NASCAR series. He is approaching 200 career wins, but Justin, tell the listeners who don't understand about 200 wins for Kyle Busch versus 200 wins for Richard Petty and how that would be different. And then maybe let's talk about whether or not we feel that it's the same or not.
Well, most people make the argument that Richard Petty got his 200 wins running in basically NASCAR Cup races, whether it was some version of the Monster Energy Cup back then, even had the versions of the Winston Cup, but it was always the NASCAR series where he got his 200 wins. Where Kyle Busch has 199 wins, but they're spread out over not only the Monster Energy Cup series, but you also have the Xfinity series as well as the Truck series. And he has the bulk of those wins from the Xfinity series. So people tend to downplay that it's not as impressive. And of course, this is one of those topics where the media, it's typically the NASCAR media and their TV partners, have gravitated towards this because it's a pretty hot topic debate, where you do have an old guard of fans that don't think Kyle Busch's 200 wins are nearly as impressive as Richard Petty's 200 wins. And you have other people that feel like maybe Kyle's are, but I think that's a very small audience that feels like Kyle's wins are as impressive because, again, when you talk about the coverage and the fan coverage, a lot of people don't like Kyle Busch because they don't like his attitude. They don't like the persona that he has. So they immediately just side with Richard Petty. But I got to tell you, Eric, when we talk about which one's more impressive, for me, I go with Kyle Busch.
I'm going to have to say I'm right there with you on this one. And I'm not a Kyle Busch hater by any stretch, so I guess I'll fall in line with guys that might, be thinking this way just because we are Kyle Busch homers. But if you really look at the history of NASCAR, look at the time period in which Richard Petty ran races, and then you look at whether it be technology, whether it be the resources that teams have, whether it be the level of competition, it would be hard to argue that Richard Petty was racing the same classification of talented drivers, even if you included the Truck Series and what's now the Xfinity Series, but it's been the Busch Grand National and everything else through the years. Those series have up and coming, hopefully, NASCAR Cup drivers. And so Kyle Busch has raced against a lot of drivers who have been and are still currently in the Cup Series now in those Xfinity and Truck races. The other thing is, it's not just that he's lucking out on these wins. I mean, he is dominating in, I would say, well-funded equipment, but it's not the only truck that's, as funded as when STP was really one of the first corporate sponsors to come on to Richard Petty. Richard Petty gained a lot of those wins in a time period where they would do 2 or 3 races in a single week. And it's not the same as it was now. And I'm not knocking what he did, but he might race guys on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday and then go to a Wednesday night race, and 4 or 5 of the guys couldn't repair their cars. They wouldn't even be at the next race. It wasn't the same thing. And so you had STP sponsoring him. He had the lion's share of the money and the technology for a good portion of years in the very early stages of the modern era. Yeah, he racked up a lot of wins really quickly. I feel like Kyle Busch, if he gets, as far as the Cup Series, I would say in the 70s or 80s, I don't even know how it's even a debate.
Here's my thing. I put it on Twitter the other day. The first thing I look at is, okay, Kyle has all his wins haven't come in the Cup Series, but basically nearly every one of his victories, he's been part of a team. So there's been at least 1 to 3 plus cars on the racetrack that are running nearly identical, if not identical equipment to what he's running. When he wins in his own truck in the Truck Series, there's 3 or 4 of his own other trucks out there on the racetrack, or at least 3. Gibbs has multiple cars in the Xfinity Series. He has 3 other teammates in the Monster Energy Cup Plus, up until this year, they had Martin Truex at Furniture Row that they were basically an affiliate of that team with the same equipment. So I look at that first. Then I actually went back and decided to do some research to try to look at Richard Petty's stats and try to make some sense of them. So Richard Petty had 200 wins. They came in his first 943 starts. Then he went 0 for his next 241 races. So I went back and looked at some of his races. One of his better seasons was 75. So in 1975, he won at Richmond. He won that race. There was 22 cars in that race. He won the race by 6 laps. Fifth place in that race, Eric, was 24 laps down. He goes into Bristol of that year, his last win of that year. That was win 177 for him. That Bristol race had 30 cars. Sixth place was 21 laps down. People can't sit and tell me, look, I wasn't even born then. I didn't get to see Richard Petty in his prime, but a lot of your points are true in terms of the sponsorship, in terms of the money. But the fact that half the field he ran against couldn't even make half the laps in these races. Just the fact that they didn't have the amount of attrition gave them a chance to win the race. And when you start to look at today, where you have 20 plus cars on the lead lap after 300, 400, 500 laps of a race, I feel like this is the equivalent of the Truck Series. So that's why I look at Kyle and the competition that Kyle is running against, the fact that NASCAR has changed the rules, the fact that the cheating is just not nearly as prevalent as it was back then versus now, all that NASCAR does with the inspection process that takes place. That's why I look at Kyle's and I feel like no matter if he's running the Trucks, Xfinity, or Cup, he's run against stronger fields from his first win on, and it's just gotten harder for him. And when I look at Richard Petty's breakdown, the fact that he went basically 0 of 241, I feel like when he got to 85 and ran through 92 and didn't have a win, I feel like the competition was starting to get better. You had the Earnhardts of the world running then. You had other top names that were starting to come up. And at that point, Petty didn't have the advantage that he did earlier on. It's not to take anything away. It's not to say that he wasn't the best driver of that time. It's just to say that you have to look at everything that Petty had. It's sort of the same with the NBA when you look at some of the players, why it's hard to compare guys when there was only 8 teams. Or even in baseball, it's hard to compare guys when you didn't let African Americans or other minorities such as the Dominican and things play in the league. It's hard to compare and say those guys were the best of all time when maybe they weren't. So that's for me why I look at Kyle. I feel like Kyle's just running in stronger fields for me, Eric.
Yep, I totally agree. I think I'm glad you brought those statistical measures to the show because that's exactly kind of the way I feel about it. And you look at the 80s when you had Dale Earnhardt and you had Terry Labonte and you had Rusty Wallace. And then you had even a guy like, Davey Allison, guys like that, Ricky Rudd, guys coming into the series where sponsorship started to get spread around a little bit. And then, of course, there was a guy by the name of Jeff Gordon who comes along and, the series just got a lot harder and he stopped winning. So I think that there is something to say about the fact that Richard Petty was certainly a pioneer in this sport, especially if you look at the modern era. 1972 on is what they consider the modern era of NASCAR. And he was the best of the early modern era. But I don't know how anybody other than a guy like Dale Earnhardt or Jeff Gordon or Jimmy Johnson or now Kyle Busch could not be considered really the best of the best of the best. And if Kyle Busch gets over 200 wins, and he will, but he's going to amass a lot more than that. He's the best of all time once you get right up to it. Now, that's a whole other conversation once you start looking at cumulative stats versus championships, right? Because, oh, wait a minute, Kyle Busch only has a certain amount of championships, and it's not as many as Earnhardt, but he has a lot more career wins. Oh, boy, are we really going to go down that road? We'll save that for another episode because that gets down the road of, well, LeBron has a lot more career stats cumulatively than Michael Jordan now at this point, but he does not have 6 titles. So, oh boy, we're going to stay away from that one.
That's all right. In 25 years, when we're still doing this show as old men, we'll be talking about how Luka Doncic has passed LeBron in all his stats anyways.
Oh, gosh.
Thought you were choking to death over there.
I'm actually curious to see who will be the next quote-unquote LeBron James. Who will be the guy that can amass the amount of points, rebounds, and assists that LeBron does? If it's Luka Doncic, then I will be very surprised. But there's going to be someone that does. I just think that style of game, and you talked about Russell Westbrook, the popularity of the triple-double. James Harden has a good time getting triple doubles too. There's guys that'll do it. It's a matter of, can they do it for as long as LeBron James and Michael Jordan did? That's the thing about career stats, is you just have to have that longevity. You know, I was teasing with one of my buddies who actually doesn't listen to our podcast because he's a podcaster too, and he doesn't even listen to his own podcast. And he's a huge MJ guy. I think if we had him as a guest on our show, I would just have to curl up into the fetal position and cry for probably an hour, because he says cumulative stats mean nothing. They absolutely mean nothing, and it's 6-3, and that's the only thing that matters. I don't know that I'm willing to go that far. I think all of it is part of a story. And so for me, Kyle Busch, his truck wins, his Xfinity wins, and his Cup wins are all part of the story of who he is and how his career has evolved. And it all means something to me.
Yeah, I think you brought up an interesting point that we can discuss when we have more time, but you've got two guys sitting out there in terms of NASCAR that do have 7 titles. So maybe Kyle passes them in career Cup wins, but is he ever going to get 6 more titles? That'll be tough for him to get to sort of be in that upper echelon of a guy like Earnhardt or Jimmy Johnson, who both have a lot of wins and they have the titles. So it's an interesting point. It's an interesting comparison of kind of the NASCAR to the NBA world. But I always say the LeBron fans, looking at stats, are very tough. The league is wide open. You see a ton of scoring. 3-point shooting is creating a lot more points, a lot more opportunities for rebounds and easy assists. The pace is up. There could be some guys that are starting to chase down and knock down those stats records. And if you're only really standing on that, that could be tough here in 15 to 20 years.
Well, I guess we'll have to discuss that in 15 to 20 years. But no more time to discuss it tonight. That's the end of episode 239 of Talk Back. We appreciate you listening, and we do hope you go out to iTunes, give us that 5-star rating, and of course, hit us up on Twitter at TalkBackEric, at TalkBackJustin, and at TalkBackFanTalk. We hope you have a good weekend. Thank you for listening to this episode of Talk Back. Staying current on sports is our #1 goal, so we drop a new episode each Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or the podcatcher of your choice. For more info about the show, to meet the hosts, or to partner with us on future episodes, please visit TalkBackFanTalk.com. We really enjoy hearing your take on the world of sports, even when you disagree. After all, this show is dedicated to you, the fans. So get direct access to us on Twitter using @TalkBackJustin and @TalkBackEric. Check out our corporate feed on Twitter and Instagram using the handle @TalkBackFanTalk. We hope you have a great week. We'll talk back at you next time.